We are now in the second panel of the morning going to turn to three studies of exhibition histories, looking at ways in which exhibitions from the late 19th century through into the 1970s have helped to or contributed to shaping, forming, defining a sense of Asian art, at least, and perhaps changing or differing types of relationships with Asia as an imagined or real place in Australia and New Zealand. As well, I would note, highlighting some of the issues around particularly diplomacy, either literal or sort of more broadly cultural and conceptual, if you will, diplomacy that Olivier mentioned in his opening remarks. I have to figure out how to get the next presentation up. The first presentation will be given by Cherie McKeich, who recently received her PhD in art history from the University of Melbourne. And I want to make sure that I get this right because I failed to accurately list her affiliation on the program, for which I apologize. But is now a research assistant in the Department of Asian Art at the National Gallery of Victoria. And her presentation, I'm so bad at PCs. I have no idea what I'm looking at. Here it is. I freeze every time I look at a Windows desktop. I'm very sorry. Is entitled A Barbaric Display of Oriental Magnificence, Indian Art at the Melbourne International Exhibition, 1880 to 1881. Please welcome Cherie McKeich.
Thank you, Stephen. I should just correct you. I have a PhD in history. I'm actually an imposter here. I'm not an art historian. Anyway, it was a very kind introduction. So today, the focus of my discussion is a collection of Indian art manufacturers or industrial arts that are currently held by the National Gallery of Victoria, which were acquired from the Melbourne International Exhibition of 1880 to 1881. And I want to present it as a case study of probably one of the earliest collections of Indian art to be acquired by the National Gallery, but also to talk about how Australians responded to the displays of Indian art at the time of the exhibition. I want to begin, however, by turning the clock back 30 years to the Great Exhibition of 1851 and to provide a very brief overview of British attitudes towards Indian art in the mid to late 19th century. And I think this is important for understanding India's participation at the Melbourne International Exhibition, but also to contextualise how Australia responded to the Indian exhibits. As you know, pretty much what happened in Australia was, to a certain extent, reflective of what was happening in Britain at the time. Everyone, you probably are aware of the Great Exhibition. Its importance is very well established. It was the first of what was to be a long series of international exhibitions. It was also very important for India. The Indian court occupied a large and central position in the Crystal Palace, as befitting its status as the jewel in the British imperial crown. And the Indian exhibits drew rich praise, especially on design grounds. The simple elegance of Indian design captured the attention of a group of British designers and critics, the most prominent of these probably being the architect Owen Jones, who had grown disillusioned with the bad taste evident in much of British industrial design. And India seemed to offer valuable lessons in the correct principles of ornament and design. And these are some of the, from Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament, which was a very important book at the time. And it was an instruction manual, essentially, to sort of teach students about what he described as the correct principles and the good principles of design, which was really focused on the balance of ornament as well as harmonious use of colours. And I've actually even noticed here these tiles would have been relevant to that, and this is sort of what happened after, as a result of the sort of aesthetic movement and obviously the arts and craft movement which preceded this. By the 1880s, the initial fascination with Indian design and ornament generated by the Great Exhibition had been replaced by a growing concern with the declining state of India's traditional arts and craftsmanship in the wake of rapid industrialisation. The curator George Birdwood, who is a very important individual figure in the 19th century, is one of the greatest champions of Indian industrial art, openly criticised the Indian government for allowing India's arts to perish. And he further argued that the beauty of Indian art was directly linked to the pre-industrial village communities in which it was produced. And again, you see these sort of ideas which were embraced by the arts, people like William Morris in the arts and crafts movement, is this notion of going back to handy craftsmanship. In part due to the criticisms of Birdwood and others, the government responded by taking on a more interventionist role in preventing the decline and degradation of Indian art. Museums and international exhibitions were drawn into this agenda by collecting and documenting examples of good craftsmanship and by expanding the local and foreign markets for Indian art. So the Melbourne International Exhibition sort of occurred at an important juncture in terms of British interest in and attitudes towards Indian art. And here we have the Indian court at the Melbourne International Exhibition. It's a pity it's not in colour, actually, but it gives you an idea of the quantity of goods which came. The Melbourne International Exhibition opened to great fanfare in October 1880. According to official reports, India was more fully represented at this exhibition than at any one previous. And here is another photograph of the Indian court. The stated purpose of the Melbourne International Exhibition was to promote the trade of Indian goods in Australia. Raw products such as tea, cotton and jute were regarded as the most suitable for trade. However, it was also hoped that a market might be found in Australia for India's industrial arts, not just for commercial reasons, but also to encourage their revival. For many visitors, the Melbourne International Exhibition provided their first encounter with Indian materials and culture. Reviews of the Indian court, published in various local and interstate newspapers, provide a good indication of how Australians responded to the exhibits. Much was made of the mysterious and exotic opulence of the Indian displays. Melbourne's daily newspaper, The Age, for example, referred to the strange combination of wealth and splendour and the barbaric display of Oriental magnificence. A pair of gold-mounted elephant tusks used by the Raja of Burma to deliver letters to the Viceroy of India prompted another newspaper to remark on the, and I quote, barbaric splendour which Oriental princes indulge in. The displays of Indian gold, silver and brasswork contained a bewildering selection of goblets, vases, cups, jugs, plates, dishes, and many articles so purely Oriental in their construction that a European cannot even guess at their use, nor do the names attached to them help you very much. For when you find that a utensil is a chombu, a lota, a pikdan or pandan, you are not much wiser than you were before. There were curious brass objects used for temple worship and figures of the most grotesque Hindu deities carved from marble, wood and ivory. The Australasian sketcher, describing a marble statue of Ganesh, wrote, "This extraordinary being is to the Hindu the god of wisdom, though some of the more intelligent classes of natives cannot understand how any man of wisdom could transfer his brains into the head of an elephant and speak through a trunk." For an authentic Indian encounter, visitors to the Melbourne International Exhibition could stop at the tea room, situated in a separate annex of the Indian court, where each afternoon two, and I quote, olive-hued, dark-eyed Hindus dressed in light tunics and large linen turbans served tea grown in Darjeeling, Assam and the Nilgiri Hills. This was a very elaborate sort of PR stunt, really, on behalf of the Calcutta Tea Company. Or form of advertising. The room itself provided a suitably exotic setting in which to relax and make conversation. The floor was richly carpeted and the walls were covered in the choice and curious fabrics peculiar in their manufacture to India. There was a nice suite of blackwood furniture richly carved and upholstered in embossed amber satin. And this is obviously a sketch from the Indian court, and I noticed that all the customers are young females. With the exception of this elderly couple on the side here, who are looking most, very disapprovingly on the scene, and it sort of plays up to this, I guess, this sort of Orientalist stereotype of the sort of central romantic Indian caricature. Although Australians had yet to embrace the fashion for aesthetic furnishings, and it's been argued that the Melbourne International Exhibition really sort of popularised aesthetic taste in Melbourne. There did exist an awareness that the arts of India were to be valued on design grounds for their harmonious use of colour and balance of ornament, as well as for their hand craftsmanship. The patterned cashmere shawls were described as exquisitely wrought and adorned with colours so rich and so artistically blended as to produce an effect which Western civilization, with all its apparatus and appliances, attempts in vain to imitate. And another newspaper report stated that some of the patterns are what is known as shawl or cashmere. The objects are represented as quite flat and without shading. But notwithstanding this, the general effect is pleasing, and the neglect of perspective is forgotten amid the skillful grouping of the figures and harmony of the colouring. Despite the obvious fascination with India, officials reported that the sale of objects from the Indian court was small, and the Indian Commission offered a number of reasons for this. Many of the goods displayed were simply too expensive, or were rendered such due to prohibitively high protective duties. For example, the Kutch silverwork from Bombay, which was regarded as one of the highlights of the Indian court, was much admired but too high priced for colonial buyers. And the chicken work from Bengal was also greatly admired but similarly considered too highly priced. And a lot of the more sort of luxurious exhibits were later sent back to India unsold. It was also suggested that Australians were too unsophisticated to appreciate the more refined qualities of Indian art and design. And I quote, "The leisured wealthy classes who would buy this description of goods are wanting in Australia just as yet. The people are too utilitarian in the main. Likewise, the delicate muslins from Dhaka were only appreciated by the few who really knew what they were. Australia is as yet too utilitarian a country for such exquisitely fine fabrics as these." And again, to explain the poor sales in jewellery, as previously remarked, the wealthy dilettante class in Australia are not numerous. Wealth there is in abundance, and liberality too, but there are not found many purchasers of merely artistic articles for adornment and not practical use. Not surprisingly then, the Indian objects that did sell were practical items such as carpets, rugs and mattings. Cotton carpets, called durries, were considered particularly suitable for Australian life because they wore well, they washed readily, they were cool and durable and do not harbour vermin or contagion, as well as cheaper items such as hand punkahs, embroidered fulkaris, peacock feather trimmings and bangles, also quite popular. It was also the case that the Indian exhibits were overshadowed by the vast displays of things from Europe. Edward Buck, who was the president of the Indian Commission, wrote that it is difficult to predict what articles will find a ready sale at exhibitions in other countries. At Melbourne, where for the first time the colonists had the opportunity of seeing many wares of European manufacture, novelties were so numerous that Indian wares did not attract the attention that they usually command. Moreover, if Australians wanted to keep up with the latest aesthetic fashions, they could bypass India altogether and purchase Eastern-inspired objects from the British court. So we have large selections of carpets, which were in the Persian, Japanese, Indian, medieval styles. And many of the patterns on the shawls and textiles manufactured in Manchester were of an Oriental type, taken from Indian shawls or Japanese papers. And these mass-produced English-made imitations of Indian shawls were often much cheaper than their authentic Kashmiri counterparts and were often adapted to suit European tastes. The preference for European things was also evident in the objects purchased by the National Gallery at the Melbourne International Exhibition. The gallery was allocated £1,500 from the government, to which it added a further £1,000 to spend on artworks. And of this, just over £1,500 was spent on paintings, including 5 oil paintings from the German, French, British and Belgian courts, 3 watercolour drawings from the British court, and a number of sketches made for the graphic newspaper. The remainder of the funds, just over £1,000, was spent on art objects, mostly European again, including Venice and Murano glassware, English porcelain by Dalton, Minton and Royal Worcester, and German stoneware by Villeroy and Bosch. Non-Western objects included samples of Japanese lacquer and bronzes, and from India, valuable specimens of metalwork and armour, and a casket in bronze which cost the gallery £50. And by contrast, when at the Great Exhibition, what would become the South Kensington Museum spent almost a quarter of its funds allocated on Indian art. That the National Gallery spent the bulk of its funds on European paintings was in keeping with its collecting policies at the time. In 1863, the Gallery's Commission of the Fine Arts determined that original paintings would form the chief part of the collection, along with some copies of pictures in European collections. Their policy reflected wider notions also of what constituted fine art in the 19th century. In the classical tradition, fine art was, of course, painting and sculpture, and it was also European in origin. So the art galleries at the Melbourne International Exhibition, they had a separate fine art gallery space, included paintings from Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, New Zealand and Australia. It's also interesting to note that in the Italian court it included ivory carvings and wood, but similar works from India were not represented. But that was not unusual. In the 19th century, it was widely accepted that India did not have a fine art tradition. And even George Birdwood, who really championed Indian industrial arts, did not believe in the existence of fine art in India. He objected to Hindu sculpture in particular, going so far as to argue that quote, the monstrous shapes of the Puranic deities are unsuitable for the higher forms of artistic representation, and this is possibly why sculpture and painting are unknown as fine arts in India. The fine arts were exclusive to the West, while Indian art, however much admired for its design and ornamentation and for the ideal social context in which it was produced, was relegated to the sphere of the lesser arts. The National Gallery's collection of Indian art would have remained confined to just a few of these items if it were not for the sizable donation it received from the Indian Commission. This was quite a common occurrence at international exhibitions where commissions and courts would exchange. So, Australia would receive items from India and would send to India items from Victoria or New South Wales, whatever, to sort of facilitate this idea of trade. The collection donated to the National Gallery included a set of Hindu musical instruments, specimens of metalware, carved and leatherwork, samples of all the schools of Indian pottery, utensils used in temple worship, a set of miniature clay figures which represented the people, occupations and castes of India, and a collection of Indian jewellery. And the purpose of the collection was to encourage trade, as I just said, by reminding Australians of the goods that India could supply. Museums sort of took on a very important role after the exhibitions, because exhibitions were very temporary, they were ephemeral. Basically, they came, they lasted for 6 months, and then everything was dispersed. And so museums sort of became the permanent repositories for a lot of the material shown at exhibitions. So, in the words of the Executive Commissioner for India, the collections provided a permanent, useful object lesson. So, the Melbourne International Exhibition provided the NGV with its sort of first significant collection of art from the Indian subcontinent. It didn't really mark the beginning of a more systematic policy for collecting Indian art. On the contrary, tracing the collection since its acquisition in 1881, it sort of reveals a rather ambivalent attitude towards Indian art on behalf of the NGV. Collections sort of came in sort of very piecemeal and sporadically. And then in 1943, several of the pieces of Indian brass and pottery were de-accessioned. They were actually sold by auction at Leonard Joel's auction house. The objects, along with about 750 other items from the Oriental collection, as it was called, including porcelain, pottery, jade, bronze and ivory from China and Japan, were considered to be surplus, in quotes, and not up to museum standard. Although what that meant precisely is unclear. In the late 1990s, the collection of clay figures, along with mats and sort of basketware, was transferred to Museum Victoria, the most likely reason being they were considered sort of ethnographic materials rather than art objects. The collection, as it exists today, can be considered historically significant for its connection to the international exhibition movement, in which India consistently played a prominent role. And it also tells us much about Australian attitudes towards Indian society and material culture, as well as representing a burgeoning cultural and commercial relationship. The collection is aesthetically significant too, I would argue, demonstrating as it does a period when Indian art and craftsmanship underwent significant changes due to the growing European influence and concerns about its decline. And I want to conclude just by showing you some of the objects which came in from the exhibition. This is just the gallery at the moment is sort of digitising a lot of their Indian materials, and I'm currently doing some research on this particular collection for them. So this is a salver from Moradabad in what was the northwestern provinces and now Uttar Pradesh. And this is one of the objects that the gallery purchased. This is a water vessel or surahai from Lucknow. And they had quite a bit of pottery. Unfortunately, the comment was made that a lot of it was broken sort of en route to Melbourne. But this is a piece from Delhi, which was in the Punjab. This is a silver incense burner. And there's some of the jewellery. This is gold jewellery. This is from Madras, as is this piece here. And the collection, it's quite a small collection. And in particularly, the temptation always is to compare it to the collections which are sort of in museums such as the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has an incredibly superb collection of decorative arts from India. But and these sort of wouldn't be classified as probably the best pieces of Indian art that were shown. As I mentioned, a lot of the best pieces, they were sent back to India because they weren't selling, and a lot, the National Gallery wasn't interested in purchasing them. So, and here this is a hookah base, which is in the style called Bidriware. And these are the clay. This is a small selection of the clay figures, which were actually one of the most popular exhibits at the international exhibitions, even beginning with the Great Exhibition. They were made in Pune, Lucknow, and Krishnanagar, which is now Krishnanagar in Bengal, and the Krishnanagar ones were sort of the most highly regarded. But the museum, this collection is at Museum Victoria at the moment, and they've got about 160 of these, and it's a really fascinating collection. And during my research, I actually went to Krishnanagar, which is north of Kolkata, and they still make, the same family are still making, well, their principal job is to make the idols for the pujas, but they still make these ethnographic figures in the same style. This is one of the really popular object, which is the inlaid workboxes, sandalwood inlaid with horn. And I've sort of added these to the end. I was sort of looking at what other objects came in sort of after the exhibition, up until the 20th century, and there's like a sample. This is one of about 33 samples of textiles which came in about, I think, in the 1890s. A sword, and this. But there was really not much at all, and it wasn't really until probably the sort of early to mid 20th century that Indian art was started collecting. But it was very much sporadic and dependent on individual donations and collections. And that's the end of my presentation.